All right, in Unit 2, Video 2, we're going to look at some more causes of the American Revolution. We're going to start with the Committees of Correspondence for this video. The colonies formed these committees to write back and forth and communicate with each other on things that were concerning them. They started in the larger cities like Boston and Philadelphia, but as time goes on, they become more and more numerous throughout all of the British colonies. These were called the Committees of Correspondence because they were corresponding with each other, communicating with each other, and they give us an early example of colonial unity. Your first question there asks you, what role did the Committees of Correspondence serve? They served as a way for the colonists to have some sort of communication between each other. They're going to also bring about unity, as I mentioned, but the big role that they play is communicating and keeping each other up to date with what was going on in their individual colonies. Looking now at the Sons of Liberty and also the Daughters of Liberty. Samuel Adams formed the Sons of Liberty to protest the Stamp Act in Boston. They would make effigies of tax collectors, and we talked about what effigies were in the last video, these likenesses of tax collectors. They would hang them, burn them. They denied entry to ships that were carrying these stamps, and they organized other protests throughout the city. Because the colonies boycotted a lot of British goods, one of those things was cloth. The Daughters of Liberty were formed, and they spun yarn to make clothes at home. It was called homespun, and they were instrumental in this boycott because without someone actually making these clothes, the boycott really would have fell through. It kind of gave practicality to the boycott. Because of these groups, the Stamp Act was repealed after just a year, and it was really ineffective because Britain spent more money trying to enforce the Stamp Act than they were actually making on the tax itself, so it really cost Britain more money. The picture on the right here, take a look at it first. It says a patriotic young woman, and it depicts one of the Daughters of Liberty in front of the spinning wheel. She's making some clothes. The picture on the left I think is very interesting though. The tree in the background says Liberty Tree, and you can see in the tree that there is a noose, and the Stamp Act is hung up in the tree, but it's upside down. This gentleman that's been tarred and feathered is a tax collector, and these are the colonists. This would be a pro-British cartoon, an anti-colonial cartoon. It shows how the colonists' idea of authority is basically from the British standpoint. So in Britain's mind, it's showing the colonists as very almost demonic if you look at how they're looking at the tax collector here with the stamp. So it wasn't all pro-colonists in this time. There were many who favored Britain. They were called loyalists. So why were the Sons of Liberty important? They really get the ball rolling in Boston in terms of protests and fighting against Britain's rule. That would be the key, that they're rallying people to fight against Britain's authority. What did the Daughters of Liberty do? We talked about how they made homespun, so they made clothes and other things that the colonies were boycotting to hurt Britain economically. They did a lot of the things behind the scenes that made those boycotts possible. Let's go to the Intolerable Acts, and this is really going to bring the hammer down on the colonies. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which actually brought the price of tea down in the colonies. The colonists, though, thought that it was just a trick to get them to pay the tax on tea, so they boycotted. They boycotted the tea that was brought to them, even though it was cheaper than the smuggled tea that they were buying. They refused the tea entry to the colonial port of Boston. They wouldn't let the ships land. And the British insisted that the tea be kept on board until they could land their ships at the docks. Shortly after this, the Sons of Liberty orchestrated the Boston Tea Party, and you're probably familiar with this. They threw almost $1 million worth of tea into the Boston harbor, and Parliament responded with the Intolerable Acts. Parliament called these the coercive acts, and the colonists are going to rename them the Intolerable Acts because of how much they despise them. We need to be familiar with three of its major parts here, and they are listed on the screen. The first, the port of Boston was closed until they could repay the tea, the money that was lost from the tea. If you know anything about Boston, if you paid attention closely in the first unit, you saw that New England colonies were about shipping, about trade. So if the port is closed, they really are crippled. And so the closing the port of Boston was going to be a big one. The second thing is the Quartering Act. It was renewed in the colonies, which basically said that British troops could knock on your door and you would have to give them a place to stay and food. Didn't matter if you supported the British or not, the Quartering Act was a law. The colonists hate this one so much that when they finally form their own country and create a constitution, the third amendment to that constitution will outlaw quartering. So they're really going to hate that one. And number three, any British official that was accused of crimes would go back to England rather than have their trial in Massachusetts, because they thought that they would not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. Instead of forcing Massachusetts into submission as the Intolerable Acts were designed to do, they actually unified the colonies to work as a group against the British. So it really had the opposite effect. It just kind of galvanized them into fighting this royal authority even more. Here's a depiction of the Boston Tea Party. As I said, you're probably very familiar with this one, or at least the story. So, how did the colonists respond to the Intolerable Acts? It really brought about unity in the colonies. They, fought even harder against this imperial authority, against Britain, and it just made them want even more to rebel and become an independent country. The last thing we're going to look at on this video is a pamphlet entitled Common Sense. In January of 1776, so we're just 6 months away from the Declaration of Independence at this point, an anonymous pamphlet was published called Common Sense. The author, as it would later be found out, his name was Thomas Paine. He wrote out a clear rationale for colonial independence that anybody could understand, the common man could understand. They read this in town squares, they printed this in the newspapers. Anyone could really understand what he was saying. In his pamphlet, he points out the absurdity of a continued loyalty to King George III. And many colonists shifted blame from Parliament to the king himself as a result of Paine's pamphlet. His arguments were read or heard by nearly every colonist, really, because of how widespread it was, and his arguments played an enormous role in the call for independence. Here's a copy of the front cover. This is him on the right here, Thomas Paine. Why was Thomas Paine's Common Sense important during the movement for independence? It does not call for reconciliation. Common Sense is not a pamphlet that discusses the colonies and Britain making things right. It was important because it called for a absolute break. At one point, he says that an island cannot rule a continent, meaning Britain can't rule America. And so that was Paine's major argument here, was that the time for reconciliation was over, and people believed that, and they wanted to really break away. They wanted to become independent.